Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of a Meezan lecture series. Today we will begin a new topic, and it relates to the economic Shariah. And in fact, it is called the economic Shariah. And as you would be knowing that we have covered various topics from Ustaz Javed Ghamidi's Meezan, which is his understanding of the contents of Islam. We are not studying this book in the sequence that it has been written. We have been selecting various topics, and inshallah, once we are through with the whole book, we will recompile the lecture series in the order in which these in which these topics occur in this book. The most important thing that we have to understand here is that Ustaz Javed Ghamidi has divided the contents of religion into two parts, and he has derived this from the Quran itself. According to explicit verses of the Quran, the content of religion, or the content of Islam, is distinctly divided into al-hikmah and al-shariah. Al-hikmah, which literally means wisdom, relates to philosophical questions regarding faith issues and moral issues. So faith and morality are the two main topics as far as al-hikmah is concerned. And the other content, or the something which relates in juxtaposition to the hikmah part, is called the ash-shariah. It's also called the al-kitab. So ash-shariah consists of various directives related to affairs between human beings in which they have to interact. This includes the social sphere, the penal sphere, the economic sphere, the political sphere. So the directives which have been given vis-a-vis the Sharia regarding these spheres have been compiled separately. The other important thing that he has inferred is that as far as a system is concerned regarding these spheres, there is no such system to be found in the Quran. What the Quran does tell us are certain principles, certain rules, and certain regulations. In fact, what can be called of them is that they're the Sharia related to that sphere, and that Sharia is constant. The system which is to be based on that Sharia will be derived by political scientists or economic experts or social experts vis-a-vis the principles which are ingrained in the Sharia. So in other words, these principles or these statutes of the Sharia, these are eternal principles. But the system that will be derived or inferred will incorporate these principles, but it will be different in different periods of time. It can be different in the same period of time for different countries, as long as these principles are enshrined in it, they are taken into proper account. So that is why he has divided the Sharia part of his book into various topics in which the statutes and regulations regarding that particular topic are given, and after that it is left, as I said, to people to come to grips with these principles and then lay out a system on their behalf. So today we are going to begin with the topic which is called the economic Sharia. And on the same note, we can see that the Sharia that has been given regarding economics and the political sphere is something which will be based on principles, and these are statutes, and on the basis of these statutes, the system that can be formulated would be done so by economic experts and economists vis-a-vis when they take into account these principles. So the economic Sharia has been revealed by the Almighty through his last prophet, the one that we can study today, for the purification of the economy and the economic affairs of a country. And we have to note this, that it is based on the Quranic philosophy of creation. So according to this philosophy, the Almighty has created this world as a trial and test for human beings. Every person has therefore been made to depend on others for his living. No one in this world can live independently as regards needs and requirements. In other words, a person of the highest rank is dependent on others, and people have to turn to even the most ordinary to fulfill them. So, in other words, every single person has an important role to play, and no person can live a life independent of others as far as his needs are concerned. And people have been blessed with varying abilities, intelligence, and inclinations, as well as with varying means and resources. And it is because of this variation that a society comes into being. So we can see that as far as our society is concerned, it is composed of, it consists of various elements of various people. We have scholars, we have people who are absolutely adept in academics. We have people who work hard in these affairs, and on the other hand, we have people who work for their menial in the menial sphere. They are one who might be tilling the soil, or maybe who might be producing marvels from machines, or they are artisans whose craftsmanship builds astounding skyscrapers. But as I said, both these categories of people, or different categories of people, abounds in our society. And on this basis, the Quran has laid down its basic principle of the economic Sharia. And you can see this basic principle in front of you in this screen. And this is verse 32 of the 43rd surah of the Quran. It says, نحن قسمنا بينهم معيشتهم في الحياة الدنيا ورفعنا بعضهم فوق بعض درجات ليتخذ بعضهم بعضا سخريا ورحمة ربك خير مما يجمعون. We have allocated among them their livelihood in this world in such a manner that we have raised some in status above others, so that they can mutually serve each other. And better is your Lord's mercy than what they are amassing. So you can clearly see that the Quran has said that by creating various classes of people, the Almighty is testing whether the big and small, the high and the low, create a society based on cooperation and respect, or create a disorder in this world by disregarding the role each person has been ordained to play. And this latter attitude, of course, would lead them to humiliation in this world and to a grievous doom in the hereafter. So basically, it is this test through which the Almighty is trying to gauge whether we deserve His eternal paradise or we deserve the ignominy of hell. And this trial has also been, although it doesn't form the basic principle, but as you can see, the important thing that the Quran is underlined here is also displayed before you in the form of this verse. وَنَبْلُكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ. And we are trying you by giving you happiness and sorrow to test you, and to us you will be returned. So it is to salvage human beings in this trial that the Almighty has guided them through His prophets and revealed this economic Sharia to cleanse and purify them. So as far as the Sharia is concerned, which we will just study, this is meant for this purification, and it is based on this substitute that the society is not based on the same level of people. People have different abilities, they have different attitudes, they have different inclinations, and as a result, some are more talented, some are less talented, and this ultimately results as a consequence into various sections of the society, with each section depending on the other in some form or the other. So as far as the Sharia itself is concerned, the economic Sharia itself is concerned, Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi has said, or he has derived, that it is based on 4 statutes. So these are 4 principles, four pillars, you can say, on which this Sharia stands. And as far as a system that a person can derive on the basis of the Sharia, as I said earlier on, it can be different for different periods of time. It can be different for different societies, as long as it upholds these 4 statutes, these 4 principles. So the first of them that he has summarized here is called usurpation of wealth. So it is prohibited to devour other people's wealth and property by unjust means. Gambling and interest are some horrendous forms of usurpation. Other economic activities should also stand permissible or prohibited in the light of this principle. This is the first principle. This is just a summary that we are at the moment going through. We will take up each of these principles separately and we'll study it into more detail. But for the moment, the first principle, or the first pillar of the economic Sharia, is that illegally devouring the wealth of other people has to be put an end to, and the state has to take has to play its role. And any illegal activity which actually leads a person to usurp the money of others has to be ended at all cost. As far as the second statute is concerned, or the second principle is concerned, this has been called as national assets. And he has written that wealth and assets which are not in the ownership of an individual or cannot be in his ownership should remain in the ownership of the state, so that this wealth should not get concentrated among the rich, and that it be directed to those sectors of the society which are dependent on others for their needs. Similarly, certain obligations to the state can also be fulfilled through this means. So what he has said here is that things which cannot be given in private property, in private ownership, and things which are meant for the collectivity, they have to be, all these things have to be owned by the state. Or if they are given into private ownership, then wealth shall definitely accumulate in certain sectors of the society. The people who are more able, wealth will start flowing towards them. And as a result, it will get concentrated among such people. So in order to stop this, all such collective assets and collective wealth must belong to the state. And the state then uses this wealth for public good and public welfare. As I said, we will inshallah study some of the details which should be known as far as these national assets are concerned. For the moment, we are just summarizing the Sharia, and this was the second pillar. Now, as far as the third pillar is concerned, or the third principle, it is called documentation in evidence. And it means that in affairs such as various financial transactions, making a will, and acquiring a loan, the parties involved should write down a document and call in witnesses on the contract written. And indifference to this can at times lead to great moral misconduct. So things have to be documented. This is a very important statute of the Sharia, that whenever there is some financial transaction going on, whether it's a loan which is being acquired, whether it's a lease document which is to be signed, whether it is any sort of transaction, and this of course also includes the writing of the will, which is incumbent upon people, that whenever this is done, that it should be documented. And not only should it be documented, but it should also be evidenced, which means that witnesses should be called upon this document so that they can testify that yes, this transaction or this will was executed or should be executed. And as far as this loan was concerned, yes, the two parties agreed to it, so that in future there is a point of reference, there is something that they can refer to. And you must agree with me, and I'm sure you would, that there are so many instances that we have seen in our lives that because of not documenting these financial transactions, we have gone through a lot of agony and pain, maybe our brothers and sisters, maybe people that we know, because they have not paid heed to this all-important injunction of the economic Sharia, that whenever there is some economic activity, any sort of economic transaction, then whether it is between two brothers or between a parent and their child, it doesn't matter, it has to be written. People generally think that if we ask the other party to write it down, then this would seem as if we are not trusting that party, or it's like a breach of confidence. We have to understand that this is not the right approach. It's not a breach of confidence, nor is it a lack of trust that we have to carry out this process. It is because of the fact that there has to be some reference point. People, when they don't write things and they leave it to their own imagination and their understanding, with time, this understanding might change in their minds, and they would not perhaps recall what the original understanding was, and they would stick to the latest understanding that comes to their mind. And our mind works in strange ways. At times, we do not recall what the first or original understanding was. But when you put this understanding on paper and through ink, then of course, it's like an irrefutable proof. So it is very important that wherever we are, in whatever circumstances, and whoever we are striking a deal, as I said, it could be between very close relatives. I mean, who can be more closer than your own parents or your own siblings and your own children? But even with them, the directive of the Sharia is that we must write down everything, and not only write down, but we must call in witnesses so that there are other people who also know that this important transaction is going to take place, is taking place. And if in case of any dispute, not only does that document stands as a point of reference, but those witnesses also can be called, and they can present the fact that yes, they were a witness to this document, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with it, and it has to be in all cost, or at all cost be trusted. As far as the fourth and final statute is concerned, this relates to the distribution of inheritance. Now, we know that the Quranic law of inheritance has been very, very emphatically mentioned in the beginning of Surah Nisa, and also some in the last verse of Surah Nisa, which details out how property and wealth and assets must be distributed at the death of a person. And it has not been left to the discretion of an individual. Yes, we know from the Quran that individually people were given this right earlier on, before the law was revealed, so that they could become, they could acclimatize themselves to this directive that whatever wealth that they are leaving behind, they must write a will in favor of that. And that will was made conditional to ma'ruf, which means the conventions of the society. But later on, a whole law was revealed in Surah Nisa, and that law, inshallah, we will be studying in detail later on as we move along this topic. But as far as this law is concerned, it is very important to realize that this is one of the most neglected areas of the Sharia as well, that at times we don't realize that the distribution of inheritance is such an important part of the Sharia, and everyone has been allocated a share, all blood relatives, your parents, your siblings, your spouses, and your children. And then you have also been given the authority and the discretion to write a will in case that you would like to bequeath some of your wealth to other people. And importantly, we have also to understand the fact that as far as wealth is concerned, that you give to your own children or to your own parents or to anyone of your own liking in your own life is not to be counted as inheritance. It is a gift, and in technical terms, it is called heba. And for that, the law of inheritance does not apply in any case or in any way. The law of inheritance that we will study, inshallah, in detail is something which comes into play once a person passes away, and whatever he leaves or she leaves behind is then subject to this law. But what he or she would give in his or her own life to any person in any proportion, in any quantity, is that person's right. It cannot be questioned, of course, if there is some unjust element or element of injustice involved in it, in which a person is without any justification depriving someone of his wealth or her wealth, he or she would be questioned by the Almighty on the Day of Judgment. But in this world, this law of heba, or this law of giving gifts to people in your own life, is not subject to any worldly law. So with this brief introduction, let us start off with the first principle, which is called the usurpation of wealth, or illegally devouring the wealth of other people. And this has been now been stated or being displayed now before you in front of your screens. Also important here to realize is that the way Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi has put forth the Sharia in various aspects is something which is always begins with the Quranic verse, and that Quranic verse is the basic verse on that topic. So whenever we'll study the statutes of economic Sharia as we proceed, these four statutes, they will always begin, each of them will begin with the Quranic verse, which is the basic verse on regarding that statute. And you might recall that earlier on we have studied the political Sharia, for example. We have studied some of the other aspects of Sharia as well, like the dietary Sharia. All of them also began with statutes, and all of these statutes or principles began with the mention of the basic verse or the basic Quranic verse on that topic. So the same pattern follows here, that usurpation of wealth, as you can see, is also entitled, or it begins with a Quranic verse. This is verse 29 of Surah Nisa, which is the fourth surah of the Quran. It reads, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la ta'kulu amwalakum bainakum bil batil illa an takuna tijaratan an taradim minkum. Believers, do not devour one another's wealth by wrongful means, except through trading by mutual consent. The verse is absolutely simple. It is something which is the call of our own conscience, something which is ingrained in us, that we simply cannot devour other people's wealth through wrongful means, through unjust means, simply because it is against justice, it is against norms of fairness, it is against fair play. we cannot consume, we cannot devour, we cannot gratify ourselves with things that do not belong to us. So in this regard, Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, as you go along his book, you'll find out that he is given a summary of some of the activities which the Prophet forbade in his times. He forbade in his times because all of them amounted to this, what we have just studied, that they would be, as the Quran says, aklul amwal bil batil, which means that they would constitute devouring wealth through unjust means. Some of these practices might not exist today, but any practice in which this thing exists will be, of course, by analogy, regarded to be part of it, and others which might not, of course, have that element anymore in them will obviously be dismissed. So just to read through that summary which Ustaz has given, I'm not going to read the exact references, but very briefly, so that you can have an idea of how in Arabia of those times, in the times of Prophet Muhammad, there were so many practices rampant that amounted to usurpation of wealth, and the Prophet had to intervene and he had to apply this principle of the Sharia. So remember, the principle of usurpation of wealth, which is mentioned in Surah Nisa, was the guiding light that he had in mind, and he applied this principle to various transactions that went forth in Arabia in those times. So just to quickly go through them. Selling something before its possession is taken. I mean, this is, of course, something very common, that unless you don't have that thing in possession, it's still lying with someone else. You start to book it to someone, and that person, before he or she would have even possession of that, would sell it to some other person, and so on and so forth. And this could result in a lot of problems. So this is something that he forbade. Then selling grain bought in mounds before bringing it to the place where it is sold. This is obviously something very clear, that this can again cause disruption, and this can again cause problems for people. Selling and purchasing done by a city dweller for a villager. This again is something which was rampant in the Prophet's times, because people would come from the village to sell their goods, and they would be intercepted earlier on, and without knowing the price or the exact amount that they should be, on which that particular product would be sold or should be sold, they would succumb to their advice, or maybe their offers, and as a result they would suffer losses. So this was forbidden in those times. And increasing one's bid in an auction just for deception, this is obviously something that is very clear. Bargaining when someone else is bargaining, this was also a very common practice in Arabia. The Prophet forbade that. Then we have some forms of transactions which were named, they had very specific names in Arabia. For example, we had this thing called muhaqala, which means they're selling crops when it is selling a crop and it's still in the spikes. So the crop has yet to be harvested, it has yet to come out of the field, it is still in the spikes, and you start selling it, because in that case you would not have an exact idea of the weight and, of course, the quantity, and this could result in losses to one party or the other. Then we had this very special form of transaction which is called the muzabana, which means that selling the dates which are on a date tree in exchange for plucked dates. So you see, the dates which are still on a tree, we don't know how they would taste. We would not know whether they are fully ripe to be eaten or not. Whereas the plucked dates, of course, they are in our hands, and we very well know their ability. So this would cause a lot of disruption. This would cause a lot of furor amongst people, because in that case, you would not have equal amounts. So also to be noted here is that in Arabia of those times, a lot of transactions went through the barter exchange system, in which currency was not involved. Actually, goods were exchanged. So it was basically a barter system. Dates would be exchanged, grain would be exchanged for another form of grain. And that is why it was said that, well, unless you know the ability and the quantity, and as well as the nature of the goods that you are selling, you just cannot do so. And this was one form that could entail serious consequences. Then we had this form of transaction, which is called the muawama. The muawama is to sell fruits of trees for many years. Of course, this is like an advance sale of things. And again, you don't have knowledge of the future. So if you start selling things for future use, which are yet to be realized, or they are yet to be even sown, this could create a lot of misunderstanding, and of course, wrong calculations could easily be resulted in this case. And then we had the Sunniyah. This was that leaving an unspecified exception in a bargain. One of its forms was, for example, was that the seller would say, I sell my grain to you, but I will take something out of it. Well, of course, this sounds a little absurd, a little silly here, but this is what happened. And it was a very common practice that he would sell his goods or his grains, and he would say, well, this belongs to you, but I will take something out of it. And of course, what would happen is that they would take out the good part of that grain or something that they would already have specified for themselves. And in this way, the person who would be buying these goods, he could be deceived, or he could be, he could actually face some deception in this case, because he never knew that goods or grains had different qualities and they were in the same amount. Then we had mulamasa. This was also a deal which went on in Arabia, which means a deal in which a person, without thinking, just touches the other person's cloth, and a deal is made in this manner. I mean, this is something, again, we may not imagine because of the bizarre nature that you just touch something and say, okay, now the deal has been made. So as much as it might sound as bizarre, it was a common practice in Arabia. Again, this was something that could have easily caused some problems, and it could lead to unjustifiable means as far as this whole transaction was concerned, and the Prophet forbade it. And then there was another deal which is called the munabaza, which meant that a deal in which people would throw something towards one another, and this way a bargain is made. So it was like throwing something, that commodity, and they would just throw it, and the receiver would have to buy it. I mean, it was like something that it belonged to him now, and the person who would be throwing that commodity could throw anything. And so it might be, again, as I said, might sound very strange to us, but this was a very common practice. And when things become very common in a certain society, we tend to develop a proper sense for them, and the common sense that guides us easily by telling us that this is something which is absolutely should not happen. We tend to lose sight of that. So if there is this question that might arise in our minds, that why is it that this was even allowed? So please allow this to happen, because when people get accustomed to certain things, they stop questioning its validity or its basic nature. Then we have this thing which is called bay'al al-habl al-habla, which means that there's a deal in which people sell camels by saying that whatever offspring this camel gives birth to, and when that offspring gets pregnant, whatever it gives birth to, then the last offspring is bought by me. So you can clearly see that the way this deal is described, it could result in a lot of deception and fraud. How would you know that the end product or the last animal that would be born is something that you would give for a certain price, or it would have a certain ability that you were looking for in that animal? So it was fraught with a lot of uncertainties, and the Prophet, as a result, forbade that. And then we had this bay'ul hisa. So bay'ul hisa would mean that in pre-Islamic times, such a bargain existed generally in two forms. One was that people would make a deal about a piece of land, and then the buyer would throw a pebble. The distance covered by the pebble would be regarded as the length of the sold land. And the other form of the bay'ul hisa was that people would throw a pebble and say that whatever thing it touched would be considered as sold. Again, something which is incomprehensible, but this was in practice in Arabia. They would throw a small pebble, and the amount of distance covered by that pebble would be regarded as the length of the land that was sold. And similarly, people would throw a pebble and say that whatever thing that pebble touched would belong to them, or it was considered as sold. Again, this is something which the Prophet forbade. And some more practices are coming up, as you can see in your next slide, as selling fruits of a tree before their quality and characteristics become evident. So you know that the Meccan and the Medinan lot of people, they were given to agriculture, they were also given to animal husbandry. So this was something very common, that selling the fruits of a tree even before it could be known whether the tree would be giving good fruit or not, it would be sold, and this could cause a lot of problems. Then selling spikes before they turn white and become safe from calamities. This is the same thing that we have discussed earlier on as well. The spikes of crops they can become safe from calamities, can always face this problem that if there are calamities, and this does happen in cultivation, that at times you have these natural calamities and they strike those spikes, and as a result, whatever deal had been materialized would have been badly affected, but by whatever calamity that spike would be struck with. Then selling a commodity which is defective except when the buyer is informed of its defects. Obviously, this is something that we know, that we just cannot sell defective items unless we divulge their defect to the prospective buyer. Then holding the milk of camels and goats in their udders before selling it. This was also something, again, that the Arabs would do, and I dare say some of our milkmen today, even they also do this, that they hold their milk in their udders, and again, the nature of the milk that would be produced is not exactly specified, not known, and as a result, disputes and dissensions could inevitably result. Then intercepting tradesmen and buying their merchandise before they reach the markets. This is again something that is very, very common, or was common in Arabia, and even today, I think there are areas in which this practice is still rampant. And then making a deal by giving money in advance, such that a person obtains the item after it is ready, except if this transaction is carried out for a fixed measure, a specified weight, and a definite period of time. So this is something that is what we call as advance, giving something in advance, so like an advance payment of something. So this could carry a lot of dangers and again uncertainties, because of course we don't know the nature of the transaction. Yes, the Prophet said that if it is carried out for a fixed measure or a fixed weight, and we know the time, then of course the uncertainty element in that deal stands eliminated. Then we have another deal called the muhabara. So muhabara would be adopting methods of crop sharing in which the profit of the landlord is fixed beforehand. So you see, in cases of crop cultivation, you just never know when or how the crop would fare in future. And if the share of the person who's the landlord is already fixed beforehand, you would never know whether the person who is going to till the soil or cultivate the crop is going to get sufficient or enough money regarding the deal that has been made. So this was also forbidden by the Prophet. So adopting methods of crop sharing in which the production of a particular area of land is regarded as a right of the landlord. Again, you can see clearly that if you reserve a particular part of the land and say, okay, whatever is produced by this part will belong to the landlord and the rest is going to belong to people who are going to till the soil, this could again produce a lot of uncertainties, and because you never know which part of the land could produce crop which would gain more vis-a-vis others in the market. So this was also forbidden. And then selling jointly owned properties without giving the shareholders a chance to buy them, except if the ownership divisions are determined and the parts are separated. So this is something that even today exists in many villages, because they are joint properties, and you just don't, instead of, if the property is joint, then it is obvious that the first shareholder or the first right belongs to a shareholder. If you want to sell their property, then the shareholder has the first right, except as it says that if the ownership divisions are determined and the parts are separated, because in that case, if the ownership is known that, well, this part belongs to me and the rest doesn't belong to you, to me, and it can be divided. And of course, there are those lanes that can be left in between that land area, so that in the case of a division, in the case of selling that land, there is no problem as far as passing through that land is concerned. And this is something that people who live in villages on far-flung areas, even today, they know that this happens, especially for joint properties. And because in our villages, we still have brotherhood systems, we have families living for centuries in the same area. So this concept of joint property still exists there. So these are some of the practices which the Prophet forbade, and they were essential that they be named, because some of them exist today and some of them might not exist today. But the reason that the reason behind which we need to understand why we need to give proper attention to this whole law is that some of the activities today might carry the same dangers and same uncertainties, which might not even exist in the time of the Prophet. So by analogy, by analogy, they would be regarded within this ambit, and they would be forbidden. And if there is some economic activity which is even specified here, and it no longer has that uncertainty, or it no longer is in a situation in which there could be some problems for the buying or the selling party, then that could also be excluded. So the important thing is the principle which is underlying, which is devouring wealth through illegal means or unjustifiable means. So that has to be stopped. Some of these practices, as I said, were the ones which the Prophet stopped as a result of this, and others which are not present in this list could be added to, because these are practices that have arisen in recent times. One thing that comes to my mind as an example could be this whole phenomenon of bitcoins. Although now it has gone into recession and maybe gone back in the back of our minds, but there was a time a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, when it was really flying high. And so this could, and this did come in scrutiny in the eyes of people who were actually examining it, whether it is something which could be analogously linked to this. Whether it should be or not could be a question that we could grapple with. But one example that does come to my mind is this issue of Bitcoin. So two other things that were also mentioned, or that are also mentioned in the Quran, and these are very important things, and they have been therefore mentioned separately by Ustaz Javed Ghamidi in his book. And these are two practices that are very, very rampant today. One of them is gambling, and the other one is interest. So gambling and interest, these are again two forms of aklul amwal bil batil, which means to devour the wealth of other people through unjustifiable means. So we'll just take them up separately, one by one. So let us look at gambling. So remember, we are studying the first statute of the economic Sharia. The first statute is that wealth cannot be acquired through illegal means in any way. It cannot be in any way unjustifiedly devoured from any other person. So as far as gambling is concerned, you can see now the basic verse which is mentioned here. And of course, there are some other things also mentioned, but as far as gambling is concerned, these are in fact two verses 90 and 91 of Surah Maida, which is the 5th surah. It says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu innamal khamru wal maisir wal ansab wal azlam rijsum min amal ash-shaytan fajtanibuhu la'allakum tuflihun. إنما يريد الشيطان أن يوقع بينكم العداوة والبغضاء في الخمر والميسر ويصدكم عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة فهل أنتم منتهون. Believers, this liquor and gambling and idols and these divining errors, and these divining errors are abominations devised by Satan. So avoid them that you may succeed. Satan seeks to stir up enmity and malice among you by means of liquor and gambling, and to keep you from the remembrance of God and from the prayer. So will you not then abstain from them? So as you can see, that there are a couple of things, or in fact 4 of them are mentioned here, and they're called as the dirty handiwork of Satan. So these include liquor, which is alcohol consumption, gambling, idols, and divining arrows. All these things are mentioned here because we have to concentrate on the aspect that we are studying, that is gambling. So why is it that gambling is prohibited? So we know that gambling is merely chancing our luck. And that is why the Quran says that it is from the filthy works of Satan. So this expression has been employed because gambling gives rise to moral misconduct in a person, which gradually encompasses his personality. The reason for this is that if an economic activity is based on rights and services and rational decisions, it develops a high moral character. It becomes a strength in a person. But if an economic activity is based on mere chance, fortune, or fortuity, it produces an attitude which is based on avoidance of hard work and service. So when you gamble, this is something which develops in ourselves, that we just shirk hard work and we rely on fortune and chance. And this gives rise to mean qualities such as cowardice, faint-heartedness. And these qualities are subsequently eliminate the innate qualities of honor, integrity, sincerity, and self-respect. So a person becomes unmindful to the remembrance of the Almighty and to the prayer, And instead of having love and affection for his fellow beings, he has nothing but enmity and hatred for them. So remember what the Quran says, that these activities, they stop you يَصُدَّكُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَعَنِ الصَّلَاةِ, from the remembrance of God and from the prayer. So such is this activity. Of course, there are three others mentioned as well, but just to concentrate on gambling, that it stops us from God's remembrance. It also has effects on our prayer routine, because you are so into it that when the prayer time comes, you just forget that as well. So that is why gambling is something that has been stopped or has been forbidden. So one important thing to note is that gambling in pre-Islamic times was also a means through which the rich showed their generosity. Yes, they showed their generosity and helped the poor and needy. And this happened in winters mostly, when there was a lot of cold. I mean, the Arab was a cold country in the winters. And because of that, those cold conditions, at times drought would prevail. And what would happen would be that courageous people would gather at various places. They would drink liquor. And in their state of inebriation, they would slaughter any camels that they could get hold of. Yes, they would do this. They would, in their state of inebriation, in intoxication, they would just start slaughtering camels. And then they would pay the owner of the camels whatever price he would demand. Then they would gamble on the meat of the slaughtered camels. So the camel would be slaughtered, they would pay the owner of the camels whatever he would demand, and then they would gamble on the meat of that slaughtered animal. So the meat would be divided into, or would be cut into various pieces. So various parts of that meat would be placed as bets and gambles in gambling, and whatever part of that meat a person would win in gambling, he would generously distribute them among the poor. So what would happen was that he would not consume the slaughtered animal's meat for his own use. So he would bet on that, he would gamble on that meat, and the meat that he would win as a result of that gambling, he would distribute that meat among the poor people who would gather around on such occasions. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, this was a matter of great honor, and people who took part in this activity, they were considered as very, very generous and very philanthropic. And poets would eulogize their accounts, and they would write odes in their benevolence. So it was because of this very utility of liquor and gambling which prompted people to inquire when they were regarded as prohibited items. And the Quran said those famous words that when they said that يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ, they are قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. They ask you about liquor and gambling. Tell them there is great sin in them and some profits as well for people, but their sin is greater than their profit. So people generally think that the Quran has praised, or at least acknowledged, that gambling or liquor has some benefit. Remember, this is not what the Quran is talking about. It says that the sin is greater than the profit that you might gain for them. And again, the profit that is being talked about is the one that, because in those times, intoxication, through being intoxicated by liquor, they would gamble, and whatever meat they would win through in that gambling would be distributed among the poor. So there was, of course, this benefit for the poor. But the Quran said that the moral sin it incurs is much greater than that profit that you might gain and distribute the proceeds of that profit to poor people. So with this, I'm going to end my today's talk, because we have covered a basic principle, although one of the main parts of that principle, which is the institution of interest, because of its importance, I'm going to devote special time to it, inshallah, next week, in which we will discuss this whole issue in more detail. But just to sum up, today we have started studying the economic Shari'ah from Ustaz Ghamidi's Meezan, and we have seen that it is based on 4 principles, on 4 pillars. So one of them is usurpation of wealth, that we have studied, or we have begun to study today, and we have seen how various transactions in the times of the Prophet would result in this illegal or unjustifiable devouring of wealth, and we saw so many transactions which were rampant in his times, which he forbade, and some of which still prevail today. And then near the end, we discussed how gambling damages that inner purification of a person. It makes a person a coward, a faint-hearted person who would not do hard work, who would take chance, who would depend on his on chances and fortune to earn money instead of doing hard work. And this is precisely why the Quran has prohibited gambling. And the fact that gambling and liquor in the times of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were also a means of benefit for people was also pointed out, because they would gamble on the meat in a state of inebriation, and that would be profitable for the poor. But the Quran said that in spite of this benefit for the poor, you just cannot justify it, because the sin that it incurs and the damage it does to our inner purification is much, much more. So with this, you can ask your questions now, inshallah, and then inshallah, in our next sessions, we will continue with the study of the economic Sharia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. I would like to remind all the participants to keep their questions related to our topic today. And if we have time towards the end, we can take non-topic questions. So first off, Rafia Khwaja, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shehzad. Dr. Shehzad, that if a will has not been written in a family, and the father has died and there's no will, and the brothers are depriving the sisters of their inheritance, so does it justify that the sisters can take the brothers to court, or would it be better, for the sake of family relationships, to avoid it and leave it to God to judge them when the time comes? Because I have faced that. I've been deprived, and I wasn't sure whether my sister and myself should go to court or just leave it, because it was breaking up our family. So what would your opinion be when there is nothing written on paper, but the brothers just decided themselves how much they would give and what they would give?
You see, even if it is not written on paper, it doesn't matter, because the Sharia has laid out the law of inheritance in detail. So the will only affects, you get to execute the will when it has been written. In the absence of a will being written, the law of inheritance will take its place and the law will take its course. So whatever has been mentioned in the Quran vis-a-vis the shares of the siblings or the daughter, the children or the parents or the spouses, the inheritance law will take its course. And if someone deprives a rightful shareholder or an heir of his or her share, then the Quran tells us that this is a major sin, and this is something that can really entitle a person to grievous penalty in the hereafter. So the options are, both options are open. If you think that this is a grave injustice that has been done, and you would like to have your legally earned money in the form of inheritance, you have all the right to take people who have usurped your wealth to court. And as I said, there is the other option also, that you forgive that injustice for a greater good, which is that you would not like the family to break up. So both these options are available. We just cannot give an explicit answer. On some occasions, you forego your right for a greater good that you can acquire, and on other occasions you think that this is such a big injustice that it's going to set a trend for other people or for later generations, and people must be called and checked for this wrongful behavior. So as I said, that this is a choice that has been given to every individual by the Sharia, and it's a choice which a person must exercise, keeping in view the circumstances that he or she is in. So I would say that this is like a choice that you have, and maybe don't have it any longer, maybe at this instance, but whenever you had it, it was a choice that you could have exercised, keeping in view your family situation and keeping in view the greater good, maybe, or the greater, I would say, a situation in which at times forgiveness is good. But as I said, this is not a rule. On certain occasions, or maybe on many occasions, because this is very rampant in many third world countries, Muslim third world countries, in which women are deprived of their share, particularly sisters or daughters. So this is a norm. It has unfortunately become a norm. And if someone decides to end this very unjustful distribution, I think it's very justifiable if things are settled in court. And as I said, the choice is always on the individual himself.
Dr. Shehzad, my sister and myself tried to do it, go to court, but it was totally breaking the family. So we withdrew, we left our shares, and we've left it to God. Whatever
Right.
happens,
Okay.
we didn't want to break up the family. But I wanted your opinion whether one could have done
So I think
something
that
about it.
maybe inshallah God will compensate you for that. So you did something out of nobility, out of something that you did not. I mean, the good of the family, the fact that you wanted the family to remain intact was something that was a bigger value to you. And I'm sure this is something which will earn you a lot of reward. It might result in a lot of worldly loss, financial loss, yes, but inshallah it will earn you a lot of reward. And I mean, this is something which is very unfortunate. And I mean, still in our own villages, this is something of a norm. Women and their lot is deprived of these shares of inheritance, and they think that since they have to go to and become someone else's wife, and that person is going to take care of her, so therefore the brothers or the fathers, they think that they don't need to give them inheritance. But let me tell you once again that in Surah Nisa, as we go along, when we study the inheritance verses later on, you'll find that the Quran says that this is one of the major sins, just like fornication, just like polytheism. This is one of the major sins which can land a person in hell if you deprive people of their rightful shares of inheritance.
So I forgave them, and we had a loss, but Allah Malik hai. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. We have a question in the chat that's related to Rafia's question. It asks, if a person has only daughters, can he write all of his property to his daughter's name in his will?
Yes, he can. So when he only has daughters, for example, if there are 2 or more daughters, then the Quran says 2/3 of the wealth will go to these daughters equally. So 1/3 will still remain. So in that 1/3, he can write a will and say that, well, this remaining 1/3 should also go back to my daughters, and this can happen.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. Javed, you're up next. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Dr. Sahab, I came across an interesting video yesterday, small video. He was referring to a term in the Quran which he thinks should be translated as an easy money. So the easy money is not allowed in Islam. So this is a very important categorization. Have you come across this kind of terminology in
Yes,
Quran?
I have come across, but unfortunately it's a wrong translation. I think the word is kul al-af. So word af is used as easy money, and I mean, I have seen that being translated, but I think that, I mean, I'm quite sure that this is not the correct translation. It actually means whatever is left over. So if you read through Surah Baqarah, I think this comes around somewhere in Surah Baqarah when the issue of infaq or spending in the way of God is taken up, and they would say, yes, aluna kamaza yunfikun. They would ask the Prophet that where should we spend our wealth? And near the end of this whole question series, the Prophet said that whatever you have spare, which is above your personal and business needs, whether they belong to the present or the future, you should spend on the society. So that is termed at times as easy money. I think it's a wrong translation. So that is not easy money. It's basically spare money.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sahab.
Thank you. Ruhi Rasul, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Sahab.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Sir, my question is about gambling. If somebody plays cards with his friends once a week or after 2 weeks, just as a game, and keeps aside 5,000 or 10,000 for this purpose and never gets it mingled in the rest of the money that he spends in home expenses, so would it still be called gambling?
I mean, what I could not understand. I mean, if that money is used in gambling or not.
His money is used in gambling, but he keeps it aside in one of his drawers, and he never gets it mixed up in his daily expenses, which he
What is the
gives
purpose
for.
So what is the purpose of that money? I mean, it will stay there forever?
Just for enjoyment with his friends. He plays just for enjoyment with his friends.
I mean,
and they
at the end of
laugh
the
and
day, You see, at the end of the day, those 5,000 rupees would have to be spent. I mean, even if that person passes away, it will be counted as an inheritance or something that he leaves behind. So I personally think that even this should not be done. As far as gambling is concerned, whether you do it at a smaller scale or a larger scale, because it is something that can always induce you to something that is greater than what you're already doing, it's not advisable, I would say. And as I said, in this case, this money, I mean, it has to come to some use or the other. If even that person
Yes,
doesn't.
sir. Sometimes he gives it to some needy person, or
So this is another important
otherwise he
thing.
keeps it
So you see,
aside.
the Quran tells us that you should only spend pure money for the poor, on the poor. La tayammamul khabisa minhu, which means that don't. There are verses in the Quran which tell us that your money must be pure for other people. It should not be interest-based or gambling money. Yes, there could be areas or issues in which you get that money coincidentally or fortuitously. For example, when you put money in your savings account, you do get that interest, and you just cannot help it. So in that case, maybe you can just give it to charity. But in this case, you are doing it intentionally, and therefore, even if you spend it in charity, that is not the right thing, because as I said, the Quran tells us that only pure money should be spent for charity. Only money which is legally earned should be given in charity.
Sir, otherwise he's quite regular in namaz and roza and is a practicing Muslim and zakat. But
So I think maybe if he's so regular, then I think all the more reason that you can convince that person that, well, this is something which the Sharia has taken offense to, and it does not recommend it in any way. But if he insists, then let the matter be settled between him and God. All that we can do is make that person realize that this is not the right way to go about.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
And also, let me take this opportunity, Ruhi Rasool, to condole for your husband's death. Your husband passed away recently.
Yes, sir.
And so I would take this moment to offer my condolences, also offer a prayer for forgiveness for your husband who passed away, I think, a couple of weeks
Thank
ago.
you,
And all the people here join me in this condolence. And also, we all pray that you are able to bear this huge loss. It's not easy. But the biggest consolation that we have in this regard is that this is just a temporary phase. Inshallah, in the next world, if we do good deeds, we will be united with our near and dear ones in paradise. So hopefully, inshallah, you will be united with your husband, late husband, in paradise. And our sincerest condolences and our deepest prayers for his forgiveness and for your own mental solace.
Inshallah, sir. Thank you so much.
Up next, we have MP Javed Irfan. Please go ahead.
सर मेरा सवाल ये था कि एक आदमी अपनी विरासत में कितनी परसेंट वो विल वो कर सकता है जो अपनी मर्जी से वो डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करना चाहे, और अगर किसी एक और इसी से रिलेटेड है कि कोई आदमी अपनी पूरी मीरास को अपनी मर्जी से तकसीम करे और उसके इंतकाल के बाद दूसरे लोग क्या वो जो अल्लाह ताला ने कानून बताया उसको के मुताबिक तकसीम कर सकते हैं क्या?
First, the first question's answer is that there is no limit to making a will. Usually it is construed that you can only make a will in 1/3 of your legacy that you're leaving behind. This is not correct, because the hadith from which it is derived is a very specific one, in which the Prophet was speaking to a particular companion of his, and he said that, well, you have your children who need your wealth, so don't make a will in such a big amount that your children are deprived of it. So when he said, well, I'm going to give all of my wealth, the Prophet said, please reduce it. And he said half. The Prophet said, reduce it further. And he said 2/3. The Prophet said still more. And he said 1/3. And finally the Prophet said, okay. So it was like a conversation that was going on between the Prophet and a Sahabi, keeping in view the circumstances of that Sahabi. And Prophet said, okay, don't go beyond 1/3. And people thought that, well, the Prophet is creating a limit for all other people as well, whereas this was a very specific incident for a very specific Sahabi. So therefore, the answer to your question is that the person can will any amount, keeping in view the norms of justice. Of course, if he does this in an unjust way, then this is something which will make him accountable before the Almighty. But as far as the fact is concerned, if he keeps these norms of justice in mind, he can write a will for any amount. There is no such restriction of 1/3 in this regard. And as far as your second question is concerned, what I understand is that you're saying that a person did not go along the Sharia and he made his own choice. So I think if he has made his choice, that we are no one to correct it. So this is something. Yes, one thing that can be done is that all the heirs agree that this correction should be done, or it could affect someone. I mean, it could wrongly affect someone in a way that the other people would not. Not be affected. Then yes. Otherwise, I think we should not temper with whatever will that he has made. And of course, it's a grave offense that he has committed. But unless and until all the heirs agree that yes, this should be done, that you should rectify the will so that the amount of legacy or inheritance that he has left behind should be given in accordance with the principles of the Sharia, then of course this could be done. But if there is no consensus, then in my opinion, until this moment, I think that they should not be tampered with. But I think this is something that we need to consider more, maybe, and reflect on this. But personally, at the moment, I do think that unless all the heirs agree, there should not be any tampering.
We have a question in the chat that asks, giving one's wealth to brothers is like zulm and supporting an unlawful norm and strengthening it. Will Allah ask about it?
Of course. You see, the question itself begs this question that why is he doing something which is unjust, which he himself thinks is unjust? If he is giving more preference to some of his brothers, or depriving others, or depriving some other relative, then this is a question that your own conscience will tell you that if you're doing such a thing, it is unlawful, it is unrightful, it is against justice. Why would we do it? I mean, unless there is some sound reason, and that reason has to be very sound, by the way, how can someone do it in a normal state of mind?
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. Next up, we have Riaz. Riaz, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Sir.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Doctor, my question is about the stocks, because everything is digital nowadays, so it really doesn't exchange hands. So, for example, if someone is buying this stock today and next day he's losing it, so can he sell it? Is it Islamically fine?
I think that, again, as I said, if a person is absolutely sure that even if that thing is not in your possession at the moment, and by not being in the possession, this will not affect any future deal, such that there would be no element of fraud or deception, then yes, this could be one thing that a person can indulge in. But remember, in the time of the Prophet, there was no means to guard against it. But today, if there are means against which you can guard against, for example, if there would be no loss or no deception for the parties involved, then, as I said, the principle is the same, that if you can ensure that there would not be any fraud, deception, or loss for a party without any justifiable reason, then of course, then that deal can be carried on.
Oh, okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Iqra Bashir, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Sir, my question is that when someone buys something or make an agreement and advance payment, but don't take that thing in custody or possession, or maybe that thing keeps into the sellers go down or don't know, and then they sell that thing on a certain price whenever they want. So what does it come under? Which category, and how is it?
I mean, I need to understand the deal a little more. You are saying that you are buying something in advance, and that advance payment is...
Yeah, for instance, you are in a business of rice or wheat. You sell rice, and I contact you and I say okay, you book my 10 sacks, 12 sacks, and what price you charge me, you agree, and I pay you. And I don't know, I don't get those rice in my custody. And then I tell you later on, now I want you sell, so you please sell, and I will get the difference of the price.
So as I said, if there is no fraud or deception involved in this dealing, then it is not a problem. So I mean, if you can ensure that that advanced deal in which you just don't have that rice in your own possession. So what happens is that in case the seller has the possession and you don't have the possession of that, and you tell the seller that instead of me buying it, you sell it to whom I have sold it. Is that so? So if you sell it to another hand and you are like an intermediary, and you're just telling the seller that instead of giving it to me, just give it to that third person, and I'm just going to back away, you just give the difference to me. So yes, this is a possibility, but as I said, if any fraud or deception can be avoided, I mean, if it is not fraught with any fraud or deception, then there is not a problem in this.
I was little confused. Like, is it mandatory to take the possession?
It is not.
Or no?
You see, in the times of the Prophet, it was a cause of problem. So it could have resulted. So he forbade these deals in which things who are not in your possession, you start selling them. Because in those times, it was difficult to store things, and you could not store up a lot of vegetables, for example, a lot of grain, and some other things. And there could be other reasons as well. So he forbade it. So remember, I've made this clear that all these transactions, if they don't result in any fraud, deception, or usurping of wealth through unjustifiable means, then you can carry them on. So basically, they are meant to safeguard any fraud or deception. If this is taken care of, then I mean, you can proceed.
Yeah, sir, but there is an other factor involved in this. Like when people start making stocking things, so prices up, inflation, and it also leads to starvation.
So you see, you've just pointed out a thing which is something which would immediately put a stop. I mean, it would immediately make me realize that I should not do it. So you see, this is another element. It's not just a question of selling from the first to the third hand, with the second hand being intermediary. It also promotes concentration or illegal concentration of grains at one place, and it creates deficiency of grain or maybe some other goods, basic deficiency for basic goods. This in itself is something that should be checked. And generally for this purpose, what happens is that the governments of a country, they make laws that this should not happen. And in the absence of those laws, it's now like a personal choice that you have to make, and understand that it should not result in any sort of loss or deception for the other people. But I can tell you, in most countries, I'm not sure about our own country, but in many countries in which such deals take place, they are governed, they are monetized. I mean, they are monitored by the government so that they do not cause any problem for the consumers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. We have one more question. Noshad Shafkat, please go ahead. And that will be our last question of the day, since we're running out of time.
Thank you, Dr. Sab. There are certain people who make deals with regard to, for example, dollars. They go to a broker and ask him that I bought $300 from $3,000 from you at today's rate, and I will pay you a month hereafter. If the price gets lower, then I will pay you the difference. If the price gets higher, you will pay me the difference. Is that legal in Islam?
I will need to think about it in more detail, but I think what the principle is something that you can apply maybe better than me. If this does not result in any fraud, deception, or loss for the parties involved, then yes, it can be put up with. But if there is any such fraud or deception, then it should not be. As far as the question itself is concerned, I would need to think more about it to come up with my own opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Think about it, because there is no possession taking over or handing over, or he does not literally sell. I know of this, having been at the Karachi Stock Exchange for a long time. That
if you could just write out your question to me. Okay, write this question to me and send it to me, and I'll try to apply my own mind to this.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. That was it for all of the questions today. Inshallah, see you tomorrow in another session of textual study of the Quran.
Okay, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.